Welcome, everyone. Dan Clark here with my work partner, Juan Escano, who's the Chief Risk Officer of Z-Horse. So we are together on this portion or this part of the series of Insights on Risk, sponsored by Z-Horse, where they make GRC easy. We are really privileged, and I am personally privileged. I know Juan feels the same way, to have with us a GRC expert. In fact, in some areas, he's known as the father of GRC, and I want to explore that a little bit with him when we talk. But Michael Rasmussen has been in GRC for about 30 years. He understands the space really well. He is renowned. He's in demand. We feel very privileged that he has some time to spend with us. And so welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's just jump right into it. I've got a big question, and this is going to sound, I don't want it to sound facetious or pejorative in any way. When we talk about GRC, we're putting governance, risk, and compliance together. One could argue that they don't really need to be together. They're good enough as a standalone. But for some reason, we've talked about GRC as a threesome for some time. From your perspective, what was the genesis of GRC, and what is the value of bringing them together when we either recognize them or talk to them?
Well, I mean, for one thing, we've been doing GRC in its different components or integrated before we even had an acronym called GRC. I was the first to use that acronym in February 2002 in a cold, snowy day in the Chicago office of Forrester. But the reality is organizations since the dawn of time have had some type of governance, and they've managed risk. I mean, every individual is a risk manager. You cross the street and you're evaluating the risks, and we're built to manage risks. And so a business itself, as well as individuals, we've always been managing risks. And then compliance, I don't think you're going to find an organization that says we don't care about the laws or regulations. I mean, I wrote a blog last year, and maybe I'll get off topic, but back in the 1980s, I graduated high school in 1989. I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and you create a character and you had to choose an alignment. And when you chose an alignment, that's like the behavior, the values of your individual. And you could be a lawful, good type person where you're like the virtuous knight, always helping other people, or you can be like a lawful evil. You still follow the rules and things. And so Darth Vader is an example of a lawful evil, but chaotic evil is like the Joker, and that, like, anything goes. Yeah, I don't think you're going to find an org. I was talking about compliance. I'm really got a rabbit trail now, but my whole point is you're not going to find that chaotic evil type organization that's just out to destroy everything like the Joker. They're going to follow some rules, even if they're lawful good, like the virtuous knight out there, or if they're, like Superman, to use the superhero theme, or like, Darth Vader, is a lawful evil with the Empire. They had their rules and structures and stuff, and they're out for dominance, but they still worked within their system. Yep. And so you're not going to find an organization that says we're like the Joker and Batman, that we're just out to destroy everything. There's always some approach to compliance. And oh, well, I got off on a rabbit trail. So anyways, governance, risk, and compliance, we've been doing since the dawn of business. But the thing is a lot of organizations found it ineffective, unagile, and inefficient. It's sort of like CRM, client relationship management. When we're talking about technology. But we didn't need technology to manage client relationships. We managed client relationships since the dawn of business. But all of a sudden, business became so complex. It was so dynamic and changing that our client information, sales had their view of the client, and marketing had their view of the client, and service and support had their view of the client, and nobody had a complete view of the client. And the world became flat, and everybody was changing. People didn't start and stop an organization. We needed better insight into the client. And so along came CRM systems. The same thing with GRC technology. We've got roles of governance, we've got roles of risk and compliance and security, but we all need to work together to see the big picture, because islands of risk don't help us, because risk is an interconnected environment. And it starts with governance. We define GRC as the capability to reliably achieve objectives. That's the governance function. Address uncertainty. That's risk management. And act with integrity. That's compliance. and they flow with each other, and they all depend upon each other, because that risk management, you just don't do in a vacuum. You have to have context. So what are we trying to achieve in the organization? Are we going to achieve it? What's the uncertainty and risk in achieving it? It's that governance function that sets the context so we can understand the risk to the organization. And from there, we do our risk assessment. We identify our controls and stuff to mitigate risk. Compliance becomes a follow through to make sure that those controls are in place and operational.
Interesting. So let's transfer that now to communicating, because I think we capture that idea and concept, and it makes total sense. In reporting to the board, and you and I probably sat on some board meetings, and I know, Juan, you've sat on some board meetings as well. I have yet to see an integrated discussion of risk at the board level. What I see is a lot of division or siloed conversations, or breaking it out into the different categories. Have you, Michael, seen any successful communication to boards around how people communicate the integrated risk perspective, or are you seeing mostly the segregated conversations?
Well, I see a lot of the segregated conversations, but that doesn't mean I never see more of the integrated conversation. From one aspect, boards are demanding more of it now because of the ESG context, the environmental social governance. Board of directors are facing a lot of pressure from investors like BlackRock and State Street that are making capital and investment decisions based on ESG metrics. Individual directors are being voted out by ESG metrics. And it's coming from regulators in so many points. So the board has a lot of focus on ESG, and that requires an integrated view of the environmental, social, and governance risks. And you unpack governance, you got IT security, you got internal controls of financial reporting, bribery and corruption, fraud, all these areas. It's not just the E, it's just not about the environment. There's so much more to ESG. Yeah. But the other thing is I've seen successful organizations long before we had ESG as a board focus. One of my favorite approaches to risk management was Brad Jewett at Microsoft. He was the enterprise risk director at Microsoft, and he went on to BMC Software. Now he's the CFO at Corel Corporation. But when he was the risk manager, enterprise risk director at Microsoft, he had this whole approach called the rhythm of risk. And what he did was, I'm going to have so many of my resources, like 2/3 of them, they're going to be focused on the routine. Like every year I have this IT security risk assessment, and this privacy risk assessment, and this other risk assessment. You know, this set of my resources are going to be set on those routine risk assessments. But I'm going to have a set of my professionals that are going to be specifically focused on the strategic risk. And he specifically looked at what's on the board and executive calendars, what's their agenda. And I'm going to give them contextually relevant risk information that aligns right to their agenda. If they're talking expanding, operations in China, here's all the risk profile and everything they need to know about risk about doing that on the agenda item. For each agenda item, he made sure that there was relevant risk intelligence and information for that, and made it very relevant to the board. At the end of the day, the board, it's been very clear, they have fiduciary responsibilities for both risk management and compliance. On the compliance side, you have case law like Stone versus Ritter and others that put compliance oversight as a board responsibility. They also have a fiduciary obligation to oversee risk, and this has become more apparent in the ESG environment. It's also regulated in some areas, like you take financial services, banking, and the OCC has requirements that the boards have oversight of third-party risk, vendor risk, and it's actual board-level requirement within banking.
I have a question here, Michael. Is in my experience presenting to the board different options to implement solutions in order to mitigate risk, they would always see these investments or these I don't know how you call it, but they would always see these options as expenditures and not investments, right? They would see them as a waste of money most of the times. So how would you focus on giving like a speech around making sure that you highlight the added value of, for example, implementing a GRC solution nowadays to the board?
Okay, well, for one thing, there's building a business case. And when I build a business case for GRC, or whether you call it GRC, ERM, ORM, IRM, whatever you call it, but when you build a business case for it, I build around the angles of efficiency, effectiveness, and agility. But that's more talking about the current state and move to a future state. And so how are we going to be more efficient in human and financial capital resources? It took us this much to do things before. It's going to be this much less with this, new software and approach that we're going to do for risk management or GRC. More effective, more accurate, complete, thorough. But at the end of the day, to make things more strategic for the board of directors, it's not just about effectiveness and how we cross our T's and dot our I's for risk or how efficient we are on our resources. To make it a strategic conversation for the board, it's how does risk management or GRC or whatever acronym you want to put on this, how does it make us more agile and resilient? And that has a lot of attention right now because of COVID-19 and the pandemic and all the cycles we're through and, constraints on supply chains and third-party relationships and the economy, and everybody's watching the stock market and geopolitical tensions. There's a lot of organizations that are like thinking, how do we be both agile and resilient? And resilient is that ability to recover from an event. So if we have some type of like ransomware, like the Colonial Pipeline a year ago or something else, how quickly are we prepared to address that and recover from that? Do we have all the scenarios planned and laid out so that we're not the next one on the front page of the paper and being dragged through the news? Boards are very concerned about resiliency right now, but they're also very concerned about agility. How can risk management help me make better business decisions and navigate a very dynamic and disrupted environment? And so when I interact with senior level executives in the board, the key messages they want is how is GRC or whatever label you want to put on it going to make me more agile and resilient?
One of the things I've seen, Michael, with the board members that I've talked to, they take their responsibilities very seriously. And some of them are very astute when it comes to risk management. Others not so much, but they're very hungry for information around risk management, GRC, how is the integration working and all of that. Any suggestions from you on how we as either risk managers or chief audit executives or credit risk officers or employees of the organization can share messages that are both educative as well as demonstrative of the value of GRC for those board members who are hungry for that?
It gets to writing a clear and compelling business case. And that I get back to those three angles of efficiency, effectiveness, and agility. And part of agility is going to be resiliency as well. Okay. But right now it's taken us this much time to do this. And if we make these changes, we'll see this reduction, this return, this value on it. And the effectiveness, these things are slipping through the cracks. These things are not getting done. We don't see the full picture here. It's taking too long to bring things together. And by the time we get the picture, it's too late. If we make these changes, we're going to be more agile and be able to see things. There's going to be less things slipping through cracks. It really gets down to a clear and compelling business case. And that really requires you really understanding your current state. Where are you at today? And then defining what that future state looks like from a strategy, process, and as well as information technology architecture. And what are the steps that it's going to take to get there?
Interesting. So that implies, at least what I'm hearing, is that if I was a risk manager, a chief audit executive, or some other position in management, I need to understand what my business strategy is very well. I need to understand what our risks are. I need to know what our opportunities are. And I need to synthesize that myself before I could share it with anyone else.
Yeah. That's the ideal state. Yes.
Okay.
The ideal approach.
In that case, a follow-up here on, one of the things that GRC does, it does provide a lot of data. And I've heard another presentation of yours where you talk about it needs more to be just the data. We need to analyze the data and come up with something. Could you expand a little bit on that concept of yeah, we need data, but there's more to it than data?
Yeah. Think about it. If we have a lot of islands of data, if IT has their view of data, and maybe that's even scattered in silos like IT security and things, and then operational risk has their view of data, and audit has their view, and compliance and legal has their view. And we have all these different islands, and there's trapped in different systems and different perspectives. we don't get the big picture. It's data and information, but all of a sudden we can start mapping these things together and we see these relationships. Then we get intelligence and knowledge, which can lead to wisdom because we can like make good decisions for the company and direction. And this could be on a strategic level, but also on an operational level. Operational, I mean, if we have a good information architecture like Z-Horse, and I can see relationships between risks and controls and policies and incidents and cases, you know, I start bringing all those things together. I get intelligence about my risk and or GRC operations. You know, why are we having so many incidents out there? Is it because we're hiring bad, wicked, evil people? Or can we map and see, oh, people weren't aware there was a policy? And that incident on that that had that risk event, we map back to it and we mine it a little bit and we find out, oh, well, the problem is there's some manager out there that says that policy doesn't apply, or the policy was ambiguous, or proper training wasn't handed. Now, if policies are managed in their little island or just like a file share where they're thrown on there or a SharePoint site, and incidents and cases are managed in a spreadsheet or a homegrown database, and risk assessments are done in spreadsheets and things, you have all these islands of information that are never connected. But when you have a strong information architecture, you can start seeing these relationships. And when I start looking at this risk and looking at how many incidents we've had on this risk and why, and connect to these other issues, whether it's control failures or policy failures or whatever it might be, we can start to become, intelligent, that we need to make these changes because we have that at our fingertips. And that's there. Now, if they're in all these little manual islands, and it could take us dozens to even hundreds of hours to try to get that knowledge. And then by then it's too late and there's more damage done.
Interesting. So if I captured that very easily. Yeah, I personally get that kind of easily where I can see the islands and I can see them kind of merging together to form a continent of information, still having their independence and being surrounded by water, which is great. Being that I have experience as a chief audit executive, obviously I look at GRC as a great tool for lending consistency for documenting things, whether they are risk things, audit things, or anything. It lends itself to a commonality of approach to view and documentation. When you look at it from a GRC perspective and from a risk perspective, do you see GRC's value proposition that the documentation will be consistent, or do you see it is there a larger piece to that value proposition than just consistency of approach and documentation?
The consistency is important because you want good structured data that is consistent where you can make sense of it. But it's also the underlying database and architecture that brings these different components together. You know, you look at Z-Horse, which you guys have, and it can do a lot of different things from controls to risks to incidents and all this. And you need that perspective, be able to see these linkages in like a relational type database or graph type database to be able to bring this together. Because right now, if it's islands of information, you know, we don't get that level of insight. And so I can have an island of information that has a lot of consistency, like our control structure. But if our control structure is over here and our risks are over here and there's really no mapping of risk to controls, I don't really get intelligence about it. I've got consistent silos, but I can't see things across silos.
Got it.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, you shared, I have a specific question around examples of good drivers or good strategy drivers of risk or GRC culture in organizations. I know you shared one. Do you have any other like strategies for these small organizations? Thinking of, I don't know, credit unions, small banks. What do you think should be their drivers or their strategies in order to drive risk culture in an organization?
It's really understanding the dynamic nature of our risk environment. That a lot of that is going to be the foundation of a good business, compelling business case, is to understand how quickly is our business changing? How quickly is our regulatory environment changing? Are we keeping things current? Are we always behind? I mean, I was talking to one bank that I worked on their business case for policy management regulatory change, and they had one policy that took 6 months to get updated. and it went through 75 different people. Now that wasn't a small bank, that was a larger one because it literally went through 75 people in a linear fashion. But in the volume of regulatory change, by the time they got that policy done, it was ready to be revised again, or it should have been revised a couple months before. It just too much is happening. And so really understanding that, what risks are out there, how are they evolving, changing the business and the regulatory and legal environment, and how do we keep up with this? And are we even keeping up with that now? One bank that I worked on their RFP, and I've shared this before, but 80% of their staff time was spent reconciling documents and emails and spreadsheets. We're professionals, whether a compliance professional, security professional, risk professional. I don't want to spend, 6 to 7 hours of my 8-hour workday, if I have an 8-hour workday, just trying to tabulate and aggregate and find document spreadsheets and emails. That's boring work. I want to be able to help improve risk management, and technology can deliver on that. But that's one of the clear and compelling business cases for this one small to mid-sized bank in the Midwest I worked on, is they had 80% of their staff time in these different silos just trying to manage document spreadsheets and emails. Only 20% was actually effectively trying to manage risk and compliance. They wanted to flip that around.
I'd like to change our direction just a little bit here, because I really like your definition of compliance. And so what I would like to hear from you is a little bit more elaboration on that definition. And the reason why, Michael, there's a lot of chief auditors, and there's going to be auditors that listen to this. And when we talk about compliance, it's typically, are you obeying the rules and the regulations? Are you following policy? And that's about as far as it goes. But your definition is really a broader definition that implies so much more. Would you mind just sharing with us a little bit about the thought process behind that definition and what it means to you?
To me, at the end of the day, compliance is about integrity. And we look at the GRC definition again. GRC is a capability to reliably achieve objectives. That's the governance function. Address uncertainty. That's risk management. And act with integrity. That's compliance. To me, I've been saying for over 15 years that the chief ethics and compliance officer, or corporate compliance department, that's really the chief integrity officer and chief integrity department of the organization. Now, will we ever call the CEO the CIO? Probably not, because we already have a chief information officer and there's a conflict in acronyms. But the reality is that the chief ethics and compliance officer today is about the integrity of the organization. The compliance has the code of conduct. They own the high-level policies of the organization. There might be other policies like HR policies, IT policies, and things, but it all flows down, start at the code of conduct. And the chief ethics and compliance officer is responsible for things like regulatory compliance and ethics and values, and now ESG is being handed to that role. And it's at the end of the day, the integrity of the organization, that when you look in the mirror, what you communicate to the world, this is who I am, you look in the mirror, is that the real organization you are? Or is it actually telling you that you're somebody else? And what you're telling the world is just fiction. The role of compliance is about the integrity of the organization, that what we communicate and say we are, that's what we live by.
I love that. I haven't heard that before, to be honest with you. And I love that definition. I think that's impressive. I think it's important, and I think it's accurate. So thank you for sharing that again with us. I really appreciate it. One of the things that I've noticed about GRC that I see as a side benefit, if you will, is that it can actually help break down barriers between organizations or silos within organizations, because people will start recognizing, oh, what I do contributes to somebody else. Do you see it that way, or do you see it as just something that's kind of normal that we should be doing anyway?
Can you repeat that once more?
Sure. I have noticed that one of the things I see as a side benefit of the GRC software and the mentality or the approach is that it breaks down organizational silos, because people start seeing that what they do might impact somebody else within the organization.
Yeah.
Is that a value that you see, or is it just kind of, well, okay, that's fine?
Oh, it definitely is. It's about how do we make changes to make things more efficient, effective, and agile. Nothing should ever be done just because, somebody else is doing it or something. It's like, how is this going to improve the organization? And to me, we're all doing GRC already, and whether you use that label or not. And I like to take like the Japanese Kaizen methodology, like those small incremental changes. What can we do to improve things? How can we make, our processes more efficient, effective, and agile? That might be through process change, people change, but a lot of times it's through technology change and improvements as well, and implementing software over having manual processes. But when it comes to these strategy and you get a bunch of people in the room, sometimes I can break that room up into thirds. You have 1/3 of the room that says, I get this, I'm all on board, I'm ready to collaborate and share. I've been talking about this myself, let's run with this. And then you get this other third of the room, it's like deer in the headlights. It's like, I do security, I don't understand this other stuff. How do I don't know where I fit. I don't mind that group, because that's just about education. You talk them through it and they begin to see the light. It's the last third that frustrates me. They're the people that sit back with their arms crossed and say, I've been doing my job this way for 20 years. I don't want to change. You guys do what you want, but don't get me involved. And those people are disruptive to any strategy, and they're roadblocks. And those are the ones that frustrate me. And a lot of times they don't want to share, sometimes because exactly what I said, they don't like change. They just like the way they've been doing things. But a lot of times they don't want to share because they don't want to reveal how messy their processes and data is themselves. And they're not realizing pretty much everybody's in the same boat. We need to improve things across the board.
It's interesting you say that. So let's go back to the board level and talk a little bit about a board member. Let's say I'm a board member and I want to kind of promote the GRC concept and have people bring to me information that is valuable. Yet my organization's not doing that. Do you have 2 or 3 tidbits of information or helpful hints that would allow me to kind of motivate my organization to bring the right info and get them thinking GRC?
You need to bring everything back to a board context, which means the objectives of the organization. If one of those objectives, they could be financial objectives and the impact of risk and themes on finance and performance, but they can also be reputation and brand type objectives. If we have this incident, this is going to cause this type of negative impact on our brand and reputation. And what fails with a board, like take an IT security risk, if I come up and say, we have these type of vulnerabilities on SAP and these vulnerabilities on Oracle, and this a lot of risk, we got to get rid of it. A board member doesn't understand that. What does this vulnerability mean? SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, these are all technical terms. What does it mean to the bottom line? What does it mean to the brand? You might need to make sure you put it in the context that the board understands that, if we have this vulnerability in this ERP, this SAP system, and if somebody compromises that can expose our customer data, and you can be the next person on the front page of the newspaper going through the press, or we could have, because of our weak controls in this system, we can have this type of fraud happening, and be the next, Enron or WorldCom or whatever it might be. You need to translate some of the weeds of risk management to a context that the board can understand.
Good. I'm thinking about that. That's excellent. Thank you.
I have a question, Michael, regarding executive sponsorship to drive GRC or risk culture in the organizations, right? Most of the times we see that it's a particular individual, maybe with some knowledge. Usually it's the CFO or somebody like that. Do you feel that this is the correct way to go about it, or do you think there should be another way of handling this approach?
Well, what's really needed is to assign clear accountability and ownership of risk. And that's going to be out there in different levels of the business. Some of those on the finance side can reside with the CFO, but a lot of it's going to be those budget holders out there in the operational management of the organization. And we need to be able to hold them accountable for the risk. And they're the risk owners. Risk management, and the line of defense that we call it, the back office of risk management, they don't own risk. Too often that's, what people think, but as a risk manager or owner risk manager or officer, I don't own the risk. It's the business that owns the risk. Risk management's there to do assessments and facilitate risk discussions and risk management. But at the end of the day, it's that operational manager or budget holder, whoever, that they actually own the risk in this area. And they need to clearly understand that. Risk management isn't about, the man behind the curtain anymore. It's about really understanding, modeling risk, and making sure that the front line understands what their risk is and is it acceptable or not acceptable. And if they accept the risk and something happens, they're accountable for it.
Accountability, it tends to be part of a culture equation, if you will. I see GRC as a facilitator of really confirming a risk culture within an organization. Would that be a fair assessment, or do you have a different perspective, Michael?
Oh, most definitely. GRC in its different aspects influence the overall corporate culture. Mm-hmm. And in that context, it influences the subcultures of what we call a risk culture, an ethical culture, a workforce culture, a governance culture. These are just all different lenses in looking at the overall corporate culture. But the risk culture is how we take and manage risk. What's acceptable risk? Do we allow people to make risk decisions as individuals, or do we have to get a group decision on risk? Ethical culture, what's right and wrong? Do we have individuals out there that have a utilitarian-based ethical system? It's like, I'm going to go out there and do whatever's best for me. Or is it more of an ethical system that's rules-based? I'm going to obey the rules. What are the rules? What are the controls? What are the policies? You have ethical culture, you've got risk culture, you've got the overall workforce culture, and is it a positive, and the governance culture of the organization. And I'm an honorary life member and a global ambassador for risk management with the Institute of Risk Management in London. And about a decade ago, we developed this great report called Risk Culture for Practitioners. And in that, we go through the ABC model. And the ABC model is attitudes, behavior, culture. Your attitudes of individuals out there in the organization become the behavior of the organization. That behavior forms the culture of the organization. That culture then in turn has a symbiotic relationship to further influence the attitudes and behavior. Attitudes, behavior, culture are all dependent and swirling and dependent upon each other. And if you have bad attitudes and wrong attitudes about risk or ethics and things like that, that all of a sudden influences the behavior of the organization, which influences the culture. And we have more and more and more of that. On the flip side, if we nurture positive attitudes and behavior, that shapes the culture in a positive side on what is acceptable risk and how do we take risk and how do we get other people involved in risk and own it. The challenge with culture out in this context is it can be completely destroyed overnight. I can have some bad event or some executive do the wrong thing or something come to press, and all of a sudden culture is completely destroyed. And you're seeing this within organizations right now on harassment and discrimination issues and things that are rampant, and people are leaving the organization because everything's coming out. And it takes years to even decades to repair culture. It can be destroyed overnight, but can take years or decades. Culture is one of the most important assets of a company. And again, it has multiple dimensions because it has like the ethical culture, the risk culture, and how we take and manage risks. If we don't, we might think a lot about the ethical culture, which is important because we want to be able to make ethical, legal decisions and not step outside the box and, get into law enforcement problems and things. But risk culture is just as important too. How do we define what is acceptable and unacceptable risk? How do we provide risk accountability? Do we have people that are making cavalier decisions on risk that they should never be making alone?
Excuse me. I just had a quick follow-up on that. Michael, you have been talking about drivers and also roadblocks, right? I wanted to ask you about if you have identified possible blind spots that the board of directors need to be addressing and they are not currently.
Wow. That's hard to say without looking at particular examples because the blind spots can come differently from different organizations. At the end of 2019, December 2019, I wrote a blog article that's out on my website called A Tale of Two Futures. Is our future a Blade Runner future or a Star Trek future? And I said the risk decisions organizations are making now are going to impact if we're heading towards that dystopia Blade Runner, which is an environmental and social disaster, or that, green and intergalactic racially collaboration, social positive future of Star Trek. Two very different futures, but the decisions individuals, governments, but also organizations make are going to set us on the path of one of those two futures. And what future is it? And I specifically point out that if you look at a lot of GRC and ERM programs in organizations, you would think that their only risk is IT security risk, because they're very focused on that. And IT security risk is absolutely huge. It's a huge risk. But I mentioned that organizations aren't paying attention to things like the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, and we just had the 2022 version of that just got published. And the top risks year over year are like environmental risks, pandemic risks, health and safety risks. And that was December 2019. I published that, and I said a lot of risk management programs need to look at the full spectrum of risks, not just IT security risks. And along comes COVID to prove my point. But the interconnected environment of risks and impact on business there. But we need to be able to see that big picture of risk and its impact on the organization. And so a lot of times we get in silos of risks because we're so fascinated on one thing, but aren't focusing on the other risks. And along comes COVID-19, and everybody starts calling it a black swan event. In risk management language, a black swan is that completely unexpected risk. It comes from when Europeans, I think went to Asia, all of a sudden they found black swans. Before that, all swans were white. They never could even think that there could be a possibility of a black swan. Does a fish know it's wet type thing? But all of a sudden they encounter a black swan. It's like completely disrupts their paradigm of what a swan is, because swans are always white. Everybody's calling COVID-19 a black swan event. And I'm saying, you guys aren't listening to history. I mean, 100 years ago, we had the Spanish flu. We had other pandemics in between them, but like a huge pandemic, Spanish flu. I'm a student of medieval history. You can see my sword behind me and things. But you got the different plagues and stuff in the Middle Ages. This is something that we've had for centuries. You can't call a plague a black swan event. It's been in the World Economic Forum global risk reports year after year after year. We've been telling people about it, and all of a sudden it hits you. Being ignorant doesn't make it a black swan event.
I love that conversation because I've been given some training, and people have asked me questions about COVID and how could we have expected that? And I just go back to MERS, Ebola, SARS, that you've had many pandemics. You should have been prepared, which brings me to an interesting question for you. I'd love your perspective on this, Michael. When I had an audit team, I remember an event would happen. So they'd run and they'd update their risk assessments and add that event to it. And I watched that from a distance, and I didn't want to chuckle in front of them because I don't agree with doing that. I think if it's a risk event, it should have been there anyway, and you don't automatically add it to something or make it more risky now that it occurred. But what it brought more to mind as I thought about it was that it's great to have all these tools, the GRC, risk assessment methodologies and data analytics, et cetera. But there's a real accountability for us as individuals to analyze the data that we're getting. Are there any tips that you would share with us on how do we as individuals get better at using GRC, understanding what it's telling us, and communicating that to people?
A lot of it's being able to contextualize it within the business goals and objectives, performance, and that communication and getting others on board. It's also not getting locked into any one view of risk. You go to the doctor and you have some type of ailment or illness or issue. The doctor can take an X-ray, a CAT scan, an MRI, can do blood tests, a physical examination. It has all these tools to like diagnose what your illness is or your issue is. The same thing in the risk management. If we just look at the heat map and think that's risk, that just locks us into one view of risk. And good risk management is going to look at things from different angles and stuff. We might look at the heat map. We might look at different risk scenarios and how they play out and things. And we need to be able to look at the control effectiveness and are the controls we put in place, are they operational and things, and what's trending out there, and are our risk models and how we're evaluating risks, are they accurate for today, or were they built 10 years ago and they need to be modified and updated? We need to be able to look at things different ways and not just like all of a sudden like push a button, here's our heat map, and oh, there's our risk. That's not how risk management's done. You've got to like look at things from different angles.
Let me throw another softball at you. I love that answer, by the way, but this is a softball. This is a huge softball. It's like a soccer ball, so you should be able to hit this one really well. Data versus experience. Is the data experience, is that a versus conversation, or is it a let's bring them both together and utilize our experience to understand the data, or vice versa? Your perspective, sir.
Definitely both. And that gets into our previous webinar we did as well, where I talked about having both left brain and right brain thinking on risk. You know, that data and stuff and our risk models and stuff, that's, you know, that's thinking inside the box. I mean, we created a box and this is what the risk looks like. And we can look at it from different angles and things and have it all nice and packaged. But the real world is complex and that box doesn't always reflect the real world. We need to also bring in that experience, our intuition in things, and look at things and say, you know, there could be a flaw here. Have we thought of this? And we need to bring both left brain and right brain thinking into risk management. And I think that experience in things comes both from the left side, but also a lot from the right side, and being intuitive about risk, and particularly in the current environment, which our models and things might not always fully understand.
Excellent, excellent. And we noticed that GRC has evolved over the last couple of years, as at least in communicated versions of GRC, software, etc. In the last couple of minutes that we have together, could you share with us kind of your future vision of GRC and what that might look like? Does it include AI? Is AI part of it? Is it not? Do we forget people, just use data? What does it look like to you?
Well, we're in this era, what I call GRC 4.0, which is agile GRC. And we're on the edge to move to GRC 5.0, which is cognitive GRC. You know, and ZHorse is like right there. In that agile GRC, which you have technology that is highly intuitive, engaging, doesn't have a huge cost of ownership, where it's not costing you like 5 times the software cost to implement, like some of these solutions out there. It is a solution that you can actually implement, configure, and build out for your organization. That's not going to break, and that's agile technology. But then we're moving towards this area of cognitive GRC, which is the role of artificial intelligence, like natural language processing, machine learning, robotic process automation, to further bring efficiencies in that. And we're in the early days of that. And we're in that transition from the agile GRC to the cognitive GRC right now. And over the next year to 2 years, we're going to see more momentum in cognitive type technologies, artificial intelligence that is, applied to a GRC context.
Is that something we as human beings need to be concerned about as far as having a job, looking at maintaining our ability to live, or is that something that will be a attribute to facilitate our own personal growth? What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's going to help us with our own personal growth, our focus. It's not going to replace jobs, right? And for the most part, there might be areas that it does, but you take something like natural language processing. Being able to read things. You look at regulatory change. In the United Kingdom, you print off the FCA rulebook, the Financial Conduct Authority. It comes with a stack of paper 6 feet tall. You know, if you print off the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations and lay it out end to end, it's longer than a marathon. It's like 27 miles. Now, if my job is compliance and I have to read regulations, it's going to take me over a year to get through any of that, maybe a couple of years. But a machine can read that in minutes. I've seen natural language processing, like taking the FCA rule book 6 feet tall, read through it and like actually map it, break it out, and look at, you know, controls and policies and all this in a matter of 5 minutes. And so what could take us a year or years, you know, machine can do a gazillion times faster. But one compliance officer I talked to said, not only is it a lot faster, it's actually about 30% more accurate. That, you know, if you had a stack of paper to read of regulations, you might get to the first page or two and paying attention. Then you're going to think, you know, are the Milwaukee Bucks going to win tonight? You know, what's the temperature out this weekend? Are we going to be able to go for a walk? Who's coming over for dinner? And all of a sudden you miss things. A machine doesn't do that. It stays on task. And so, I mean, there's definite benefits to it, but artificial intelligence also needs to be governed. it can't see all the complexities that we can. It can see things much more quickly than we can and analyze relationships, but there's a level of intuitiveness in things that a risk manager or a compliance officer brings to it that artificial intelligence can't.
I don't want you talking to my wife because she would say exactly what you said. She said, pay attention, Dan, focus on what we're doing. We don't care whether the Red Sox have a pitcher next year or not. I love that. That was a great statement. Michael, looks like we're done for today, but I have enjoyed this. I know our audience will enjoy it. Very insightful, some really very important points that you've shared with us. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Likewise.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Dan. It was a pleasure talking to you guys this afternoon.
Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.